add all that benefit, that will be called consumer surplus. Right? I know everyone's complaining about the prices, but if you pay it, buy it, you're willing to pay even more. So whenever you buy anything, you collect some type of surplus fund. Except for you pay exactly what you think is the maximum you're willing to pay. That's sort of rare, right? You often say, well, I wish it was cheaper, but I'm willing to pay more, right? You often collect surplus. Anyway, that is the consumer surplus. The producer is willing to get the marginal cost, i.e. the supply, as the price, but they get more. So anything more they get is an extra that will be called producer surplus. That is, in this case, producer surplus. Equilibrium minus the minimum multiplied by the equilibrium divided by 2. So the only producer who doesn't get a surplus is the marginal producer. Don't forget exactly how much it costs them. Right? So anyone else, all those outside the marginal producer get surplus. Alright? Make sense? So all those producers get benefits because they get more than that marginal producer get exactly what they would willing to pay. They get exactly what it costs them to produce. Anyway, now calculation of the surplus is simple. If the demand and supply are straight lines, we assume they are straight lines. Otherwise, you got to do any graph. You don't do any graph, right? So assume from here up throughout we are linear, just to be able to calculate the surpluses. In the real world, none of them is linear. Demand is not linear, definitely. The supply is not linear. So all the assumption of linearity you see throughout is otherwise unique in the graph, which we don't want to do. That's what we're doing. Anyway, so technically, overall surplus is P max minus P mean multiplied by the equilibrium divided by 2. In the world of neoclassical economics, that is what we study, they call it the measure of welfare. That's the measure of welfare, well-being. Then they say, if the government intervenes and the price becomes any different, there will be welfare loss, i.e. surplus loss. So they take the surplus equivalent to the measure of well-being, they call it welfare. Alright? So anytime the government intervenes in the price, changes the price in any form or fashion, it will cause welfare loss. That becomes what they call inefficient. If you lose welfare, that is inefficient. So efficiency in a competitive market basically means the competitive market will give you maximum surplus, maximum welfare. Anything but, you're going to end up with loss of welfare. Right? Okay. Anyway, calculating the surpluses aren't difficult if the straight lines involved. The only difficulty you may face is if the supply looks like this. If the supply looks like this, then consumer surplus looks the same. It's the same. But if you want to calculate producer surplus, it will be this area. So it won't be what I wrote up there if the supply is horizontal, which often does. Alright? In that case, in the problem set, I split the area in two. I calculated these two. So if you look at the problem set number 8, I guess, you see anytime I calculated producer surplus, there are two numbers added up because I split them in two. Although there's a formula for that in geometry, I'm pretty sure, right? But I split them in two to simplify. Alright? So if you check the problem set 8, anytime you see for the surplus there are two numbers calculated, it's because of that. not intervene because the market is efficient. Any government intervention to make the market inefficient basically causes welfare loss, surplus loss. But there's an asterisk, two asterisks. The asterisk is demand should be real willingness to pay, supply should be real marginal cost. In the real world, demand is often not real willingness to pay. Because consumers don't know what they're buying. They're misinformed. Right? Say you buy, what's that drug? What's the diabetes drug that causes weight loss? Mozambique? It's not Mozambique, that's the country. Mozambique? Something like that. That drug, you may read on the news that it causes weight loss, but there might be side effect to it. It causes weight loss by lessen your life by 10 years. If you don't hear the true story, you may over-demand it. Then the market will be inefficient because the demand is not real demand. The government should come in, push the demand backward. That gives rise to government intervention. Right? Because demand is not real demand. Supply is even worse. Often producers don't pay all the cost of production because of externalities. So you produce a good, you pollute the water. Alright? So polluting the water costs money. It costs the fishermen and the society and everything, but you don't get the price. So your cost will be lower than it should be, your supply will be higher than it should be. The government should come in, push the supply toward the equilibrium by taxing the producers, doing carbon tax, right? Stuff like that. So that gives rise to government intervention. Right? Well, in economic terms, carbon tax was fine because if you drive a car, you look at the benefit you have. Nice driving car going here and there, but you don't look at the disbenefit to others. There's an externality there. All right? You don't look at the fact that you're going to pollute the air. All right? You cause traffic jam, delay others, right? So it's fine there for the government to come in and put carbon tax. Right? Force you to pay the real price. Right? That's fine. So when we say the government shouldn't intervene because the outcome is inefficient, big asterisks. Demand should be real demand, supply should be real supply, real marginal cost. Almost always that's not the case. Right? So in the book, if you study it, I think chapter 23, the title is When the Market Fails. It's as if it rarely fails, always fails, right? But the way neoclassical books are written, they push that all the way to the end. They will give an impression that you shouldn't have, the government shouldn't intervene. Right? I think it's all intentional. It's a conspiracy. They've written it in a way that if you actually study economics, you get a sense that the government should not intervene. Right? But at the end they come and say, well, what if the market fails and do intervene? Right? But that's the last chapter. You never studied. It's the end of the book. See Pendyke? Almost the last chapter called When the Market Fails. But the market always fails. It has to be much earlier. Anyway, the story here is, this lecture has a big asterisk. The asterisks are always there. So the outcome should be the government should always intervene. But the chapter tells you the market should not intervene because you assume the asterisk law. That's what we assume for Sami, but remember, in the real world, that's not true. Intervention can be many, many ways. I have 4 of them listed here. Price floor, we call it price mean. Price ceiling, we call it price max. Tax. Subsidy, you're going to have those in this course, but the government can intervene in many, many other ways too, such as tariff, that's a government intervention. Quotas, you have a production quota, consumption quota, import quota, export quota. There are no quotas, right? Most of those that I talked about, outside all those 4 are actually trade-oriented interventions. We leave them to C60, I guess, a trade course. C60, yeah, C60 or C93, one of these. Both of them have it. And or CO8 even. Those are trade courses. We don't do trade here, right? So we leave those interventions to a trade course. As a result, we stick with this forum. But if you check the book, has more than what we do. Okay? Dig into the trade too. Anyway, I'm going to start with number 1. Then we do number 2. Then we do 3 and 4. Which one are the most interesting? I think this is the best. Well, this is one of the best. This is good. Others are fine, but these two are actually more interesting. You will see why when I solve them. I'm going to start with price ceiling. Number 1, price ceiling. I.e., you cannot charge higher than this price. This is the ceiling. Suppose that's the equilibrium. That's the price the market gives you. That's the quantity the market gives you. That is too high for the government. They put a ceiling on it. You cannot charge more than this. So, for the price ceiling to have any effect, it must be lower than the equilibrium. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So we assume the price ceiling is binding, i.e. lower than the equilibrium. Right? If it's higher, it won't be binding, it will be irrelevant. Then, that's the demand. Right? We assume for the time the market is closed, so the supply should be equal. If the producer is not going to produce more, otherwise what do you do with it, right? Make sense? The other way around. The other way around. The supplier produces this. We assume the market is closed, you cannot import the rest. The demand will be more than the supply. We assume you cannot get the supply from somewhere else. So we assume this. If the economy was open for this exercise, that extra demand would have been supplied by foreigners. That would have been equal. We assume that's not the case. It's like rent control. You cannot import houses. If you put rent control, demand will be equal to supply. Although demand higher than supply, but you cannot do anything. Make sense? Okay. So this is technically excess demand. This is the excess demand. We assume cannot be satisfied. You cannot satisfy it. It's like a rent control. You cannot import housing. Alright? Okay, so assume demand is equal to supply because the excess demand cannot be satisfied. This cannot be done. Then, let's see what happened. Let's split this in 4 areas. Call this A, B, C. Consumer surplus before was this. This is what the consumer was getting before the ceiling. Now they get this. So consumer gains. Consumer gains A. Sorry, B. They pay a lower price. Okay, they pay a lower price, they gain A. They lose C because of buy. Less. So there's a bit of help here. Lower price help them, but overall you buy less. That is a negative. This can go either way. This can go either way. What about producer? Producer surplus before was this. Producer surplus before was this. And now it becomes this. So producer loses D due to lower price. And lose D. Producer cannot possibly gain, obviously, from price ceiling. Right? They cannot gain from price ceiling. They lose on both fronts. They sell less at a lower price. How can they gain? Right? producer loses when sells less and get less. On both fronts, there's something. Right? This is transfer of surplus from consumer to from producer to consumer, but in the process C and D of loss, we call that welfare loss. Basically surplus loss. Or dead weight loss. DW. Remember DW? Who's DW? As a name, who's DW? You don't know DW? Nobody knows? It's the name of someone. Who was called DW? You know Arthur? That's Arthur's sister. You don't know Arthur? Okay. If you know it, you watch cartoon when you were a kid. If you don't know it, you haven't watched cartoon when you were a kid. DW, Arthur. You know that? They're both rats anyway. So. It's a cartoon. Anyway, the DW is dead weight loss, which is a word. Alright? Question for you. We know the producer is going to be suffering from lower price and lower quantity. Consumer can go either way. Do you think the consumer will gain overall or will lose them? It can go either way technically, but a gain and loss. Do you think overall consumer gains or loses? Say I have a rent control, right? Rent control is basically price max. In a rent control, do you think the change in the consumer surplus is positive or negative? Do you think it's positive or negative? Positive? Rent is very elastic. Rent is an elastic good. The demand for rent is sort of verticalish. Verticalish. The more verticalish the demand is, the bigger C is. So if you have a good that's very elastic, there's a good chance the consumer will lose too. That's a rent control. Right? There's a good chance C is bigger than D. Right? If demand is vertical, which is the case of rent. So why the government does it then? The consumer will be hurt too. If you do it on rent control, the consumer will be hurt too because C will be bigger than D. Then why do you do it? You're trying to help the consumer through price control, right? But the numbers, the graph suggests that C might be bigger than B. So you will hurt the consumer as well. So why do you do it? Oh, simple answer. B is gained by those who rent. That's the majority of people. They get a bit of help. C is by those who are out of the market now. That's a small percentage of the market. You basically get 95% gaining a bit each, 5% losing a lot. The loss is bigger than the gain, but you still have 95% gaining, so you make good political thing to do. You get 95% of people happier, right? Although not much happier by cents. But you get 5% of people can't find a place to live now, right? So although that can't find a place to live outweighs the little help, but majority will get help. So they will change. Sort of political gimmick. Most often, price max and max are actually hurting the overall consumer, right? Although it's helping the majority of consumers a bit, but overall the consumer will be hurt because the price ceiling is always set on very inelastic demand. You're not going to set it on something people don't want. You set it on something people really want, like rent, gasoline, stuff like that, right? So you will end up with very vertical demand. C often is higher than D. The loss outpaces the gain, but the gain is done by the majority, the loss is by minority. So politically, it's a nice thing to do. Make sense? Anyway, that is price ceiling. Price floor. That's the equilibrium in a competitive market. Right? the government put a price floor. You cannot charge less than that. What happened then? That would be the demand. What is the supply then? What's the supply then? Well, the supplier wants to produce this. That's what the supplier wants to do. Make sense? Okay. Can you force the supplier to produce that demand? The supplier wants to produce that more. There will be excess. If you do nothing, there will be excess production. Can you force the producer to produce that demand? Yes, you can quota production. That is case number one. So I'm going to go to case number one. Suppose you somehow force supply to be at demand. You quota production. Alright? That is a Canadian case of dairy and poultry. In Canada, dairy and poultry are actually price floor. The government set the price. And the farmers want to produce more, but they put a quota. If you want to open a dairy, you have to get a license. They're not going to give you a license. That's the way they set the quota, right? Makes sense? Over time, demand is increasing. They adjust the supply by issuing permits. Right? So in Canada, the supply is equal to demand by government intervention. They force the producer to produce a demand. That's the Canadian case. We call this case number one. That's the Canada case of price floor. I'm going to look at the other case. Let's see what happened here. In this case, the consumer surplus before was this. That's before. Now it becomes this. So consumer is going to lose. Let me call it again. A. They pay a higher price. They lose C because they buy less. The price floor is not trying to help the consumer, obviously. It's an attempt to help the producer, not consumer. Consumer is going to lose on both ends. Right? They buy less at a higher price. What about producer? What about producer? That is the producer surplus in a competitive market. That was the surplus. Now it becomes this. Alright, so producer gains, which one? Gains A, because they charge more. And they lose, which one? D, because they sell less. Alright? So this can go either way. You have those who are selling, but some people, some producers can't produce anymore, right? They're out. So you can see the price floor is an attempt to help the farmers who produce. That is the only one you're going to gain, right? The farmers, the existing farmers that produce, will charge a high price, they can. But the society will lose. The dead weight loss is C and D. The idea is simple. If you increase the price, see this one, this area? You will be underproducing. That's the underproduction. But this underproduction has higher benefit than the cost. So you leave profit unrealized. You produce less than equilibrium. Those numbers that you don't produce, they'll give you more benefit than the cost. So technically, that's the benefit of those. That's the cost of it. This is profit unrealized through underproduction, underconsumption. That's the idea. Anyway, that's the case number one. Case number two. Case number two, that is a US case of agriculture policy. You cannot force the producer to produce at demand. Supply will be more than demand, i.e. supply will go all the way to there and produce that. That's price floor without quota. Right? You set the price out of equilibrium. Farmers will all produce. Alright? Make sense? Okay. What's the change in the consumer surplus there? Let's see. This is before. That's for the consumer. This is after. So the same thing. Consumer still loses A because they pay a price. They lose C because they buy less. No change for the consumer. In both cases, they lose the same. Right? Okay. What about producer though? Producer surplus was this. Now it becomes this. Oh, that's different now. So producer gains A, C, and let's call this E. Because producer really gains. They gains A, that's due to higher price. As well as C. Then they gain E because they produce too much now because of overproduction. They gain A, C, E. So if you combine these two, there's a gain of E. So where's the deadweight loss? If you combine consumer and producer, there's a gain of E. This is a transfer of surplus, but E is gained. So where's the deadweight loss? Where's the DW? Oh, there's an excess now. There's an excess. What do you do with the excess? What do you do with the excess? Whoever set the price should buy it. The government should buy it. So the government will be forced to buy the excess supply. And the government spends this, let me color it, buying the excess supply. This is the government expenditure, buying the excess. That is how much it cost them. So now you bought this thing, what do you do with it? Can you sell it? Can you buy it and sell it at a different price? Yes or no? What do you do with excess that you bought? Say, guarantee the corn price, and farmers produce millions of tons of more corn than demanded. Right? You bought all those corn, what do you do with it? You can't sell it, you reduce the price. If you want to sell it, the price goes down, right? The price that you guaranteed goes down, you cannot sell it. So what do you do with it? You know what do you do with the excess supply that you bought as a government who guaranteed the price? You cannot put it back in the system. You cannot sell it. Yeah?
Throw it away.
That's one way of doing it. Destroy it. So that's actually what they did. They dumped millions of tons of corn in the sea, in the ocean. They just dump it, right? What else do you do with it? Outside destroying it, dumping it. What do you do? Well, they created, you know that USAID in the US was funded by this. USAID in the US basically is providing help to poor countries. The poor country needed corn, but they didn't have money to pay it, so they're outside the demand system. And you give it to them. That's fine. Right? Obviously, if you fund US aid with it, there's some political benefit there, but we're not going to put a number on that one. So we assume the whole thing is lost. You paid money, you bought it, you got rid of it, right? Either in dumping in the sea or giving to someone else. Nothing is back, but obviously you bought political influence. We ignore that. So we assume the whole thing is lost. So the deadweight loss become how much? is the change in the surplus becomes the big M. See this M? That is the deadweight loss. Much bigger than case number 1. This is much bigger than case number 1. Far bigger than that. The big M is the deadweight loss. This is far bigger than case 1. Far bigger than that. Case number 1, see it's a sub-part of it. It was only this. This is far bigger, right? This is far bigger. The U.S. agriculture policy of price floor is far worse than Canadian, all right? Far worse than Canadian. Question for you. Why U.S. didn't do quotas? Simple answer. The Canadians started in the 60s when the population was like 10 million. How many farmers you have there, right? Not as hard to actually have the policy implemented. U.S. is far bigger, far more farmers. Very hard to do that, right? Far bigger country, far more farmers. How can you put the quota? There will always be cheating, right? Make sense? Okay. Anyway, but that's sort of historical. Historically, Canada started in the 60s with price control, price floor, and they did the quota then, and that continues. Right? Okay. Trump tried to get rid of it many, many times through, extension of NAFTA, stuff like that. Never goes. Canada will never accept it. Why Canada does not accept removal of the price control in it? Because it will destroy Canadian farms. It will destroy. US will destroy the whole Canadian farm. Easy, right? They're far bigger, far more efficient producer. The whole thing will be destroyed here, right? You basically import every food, right? The next question is, why every country in the world, every developed country in the world has price floor for agricultural goods? Why do they have it? Why all of them apply the same thing? Europe has it, US has it, Canada has it, they have a different version of it. But they all have some type of price floor for agricultural products. They all have try to help the farmers. Why would they do it? The farmers are like 2% of the population. Tiny, tiny, right? The whole farming is 5% of Canadian GDP. That's how small it is. It's tiny. Well, Canada is bigger than US, but it's a very small part of the Canada GDP is farm. Why governments help farmers? Why developed countries just keep helping the farmers? And they're a tiny proportion of the population and GDP. Anyone? Yeah?
Because they're what feeds the people.
That's the whole thing. Is that food security. If there's a war, they're gonna embargo you, and you don't want to be embargoed on food. You starve, right? So that's the whole idea. We pay the price for a rainy day. That's the idea. Every developed country is doing it. So every developed country wants to produce their own food. Right? We can live with anything else, but not without food. Very costly policy, but sort of the political will behind it. Right? Make sense? Okay. Anyway. Next one is tax. Next one is tax. And subsidy. Now let me go on this one. If you want to help farmers, why put a price floor? Just give them subsidy, give them money. It's cheaper. You don't have deadline loss. Right? Just give them cash. Every year we give 100,000. That will be cheaper than that policy. Why would you have to do this policy that requires you spending billions of money and just dumping in the sea? Just give them the billions in cash. Why didn't you have direct cash subsidy? Anyone? Why don't do direct cash subsidy? That's far cheaper, far more efficient. Simple answer, how can you convince the population to do it, right? They're not going to accept it. It's a political thing, right? It's more efficient, but you're just giving some people money. Right? It looks bad. You can't pass it through the Congress. So all these inefficient policies are passed because, well, you cannot see behind it. You are helping the farmers, but people don't see it. Right? Make sense? So, anyway, it's inefficient, but it's sort of the only thing you can do. Yeah?
So can't they make the argument that if we don't do this, we're spending more money?
Just convince people. You can't make, people don't understand this stuff. What people understand is you tax me, you give it to the farmer. Alright? They don't like that at all. But if you tell them, well, we set the price to help your food, that's sort of different story. Although it's inefficient, but it's easier to make. Very hard to give people cash. Right? Financed by someone else's cash. You tax people, get the money, give it to someone else. That's hard to justify, right? You can say whatever you want, but very hard to justify. So they never went that path. They just even tried. You cannot convince people, right? This is sort of, they don't really see it, right? They don't see it. You just see the price going up, slowly though, right, over time, and they don't understand what's going on, right? So this is easier to actually implement politically. But convincing people that that's more efficient than this one, that's just not too easy. Anyway, you assume everyone is educated, knows economics, right? They just don't mind, right? The only thing you know is you take my money, give it to someone else. That's the only thing you understand, right? And if liberals want to do it, the conservative kill them on it, right?
Yeah, but it's right. If the incentive, the people that like your daily groceries are going to be cheaper if we go through with this, wouldn't that be like an incentive?
I don't think it's flat politically. It's the same with carbon tax. Tell people, I will put tax on gasoline, I will give you checks. Did they accept it? Nobody accepted it. Did they accept that one? That was a good story, right? So what we do with the carbon tax, elevate the price, then we give you checks. We give you money. Did they accept it? They didn't. Right? This one you're telling them, well, we take your money, give it to someone else, later on the price will be lower. They don't accept that either. What they understand is you took their money. Right? Anyway, politically I think it's very hard to sell. That's the story. Okay, anyway, but inefficient policies, but at the time they probably don't think feasible for them to do was that one. And every developed country does the same. There are different implementations, but they all have agriculture support policies. Tax, that is the equilibrium in a competitive market. If you put the tax, what will happen? The price consumer pay will be what producer gets plus the tax. And the new demand and supply will be equal at that point. So these are the conditions we had for post-tax equilibrium in lecture number 1. And graphically, the equilibrium will tilt to the left of the competitive one. That will be the price. The consumer pays. And that will be the price. The producer gets. And this would be the tax. Right? Make sense? That's an equilibrium. Let's put a star there. That's an equilibrium. So what's the change in the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus was this before. Now it becomes this. So consumer loses A and C. They lose A because they pay a higher price. They lose C because they buy less. But nobody likes the tax on the consumer side. What about producer? Producer surplus before was this. Now it becomes this. So producer doesn't like it either. They're going to lose B in lower prices and D in lower sale. So nobody likes taxes. The only one who likes taxes is the government. They get A in taxes from the consumer, and they get B in taxes from producers. Alright? Make sense? But process. C and D is lost. C and D is gone, right? Nobody gets it. Excise tax is not efficient. It leads to a lower production, lower consumption, and lower GDP. That's what it says. Right? If you want to tax people, how do you do it then? This says excise tax is bad. Right? It leads to underproduction, underconsumption, GDP loss. That's the deadweight loss. So if you're a government, you want to fund yourself, what should you do? You should have income tax or corporate tax, that's fine. This is excise tax. Tax on goods is inefficient. It distorts production and consumption. That's the reason it's inefficient. But if you want to tax people, fine. Have income tax. That's fine. You can have income tax of 90%. That's not as much. That's efficient, right? But if you do excise tax, that's inefficient. Right? Question for you. Here, the way I had it, A and B are the same. It looks like the tax is split equally between consumers and producers. Right? What is impacting the size of A and B? A is the portion of tax paid by the consumer. B is portion paid by producer. The way I had the graph, they look the same. Are they always the same? No. It all depends on how inelastic the two parties are. The less elastic pays more. If you have the demand looking like this, B will be very large. If the demand is inelastic, B will be very large, much larger than, sorry, A will be very large, much larger than B. The less elastic, more you pay in taxes. Right? Okay. That probably explains why gasoline has the highest excise tax in every country in the world. Because gasoline has very elastic demand. Right? It basically means you put the tax on something where the consumer pays it, not producer. Right? That's intentional. If you want to have excise tax, your intention as a government should be levy it on the consumer. Put it in a good where the demand isn't elastic. Because you force the consumer to pay it. Why? Why you want to force the consumer to pay the tax, not the producer? Anyone? Yeah.
So the producer can produce more, but either ways the consumer will buy.
Or differently, the consumer can't leave. They are in the country, they stay there. They can't leave. Producer can actually leave, produce somewhere else. So you want to put the tax on the immobile factor. If you put it on producer, they're going to leave the country, produce somewhere else. That's sort of the story. You want to put the levy of the tax on the party that can't leave. So you see gasoline tax so high because demand is so inelastic. The tax is actually paid by the consumer, not producer. Make sense? In fact, that's the story of taxation in North America. In Canada, in fact, if you check Canadian corporate tax, in 1990 it was 40%. That's the corporate tax. How much is it now? 12%. You went from 40 to 12. Why the corporate tax is so much lower? Because the idea is if you tax the producer, they're going to leave the country, go somewhere else. Tax the consumer. So that's sort of the process in the last 40, 30 years. The consumer tax is going up, producer tax coming down. The idea is the production is mobile, consumption is not. We want to levy the tax on the immobile. So consumer tax is well, excise tax is going up, GST, PST, stuff like that. Property tax is going up, all those stuff are going up, but the corporate tax is going down. Right? Anyway, okay. That is the tax. The subsidy, let me use the same one. Let's see what happens when you have a subsidy. You have a subsidy looks like negative tax. This will be minus. So the equilibrium post-subsidy will be to the right. That is post-subsidy equilibrium. That's what consumer pays. That's what producer gets. This is subsidy. So in that case, what's the change in the consumer surplus? Let's see. Consumer surplus before was this. Let me have this one too. Consumer surplus before was this. That's before the subsidy. How much is it now? Now it is this. Right? So the consumer gains this area. That's the consumer gain in surplus. That is what consumer gets from subsidy. Right? So the change in the consumer surplus is that shaded area. Okay. What about producer? Producer surplus before was this. Now it is this. So producer gain would be this area. That is what producer gets from the subsidy. That is what producer gets from the subsidy. That is producer gain. Fine. The overall, you get the inverted M gained by the two parties involved, right? This is what the two parties involved gain. What is it that we lost then? Consumer gains, producer gains, everyone's happy. So what is the debt loss? Anyone? What is the DW? Consumer gain, producer gain, what happened to DW? Yeah?
Government loses.
No, there's a government there. There's a government providing subsidy and the government spend this money subsidizing the good. That is the subsidy. So deadweight loss becomes this area. That is deadweight loss. Basically subsidy that nobody gets. If you think about it, subsidy has meant overproduction. This is overproduction at a loss. So that overproduction, the cost is more than the benefit. That's what it is, right? So the subsidy has led to overproduction at a loss. Actually, there is a loss. You produce something where the costs are higher than the benefit, right? Which is a loss. Make sense? Okay. If you want to subsidize, what should you do then? Provide cash subsidy. That's fine. It's not inefficient. Excise subsidy is efficient. If you want to help people, just give them money, cash. That's not inefficient. Fine? Again, cash subsidies, these are very hard to do. Politically very hard to actually give people money, right? So they normally in the real world they do excise subsidy, excise tax, stuff like that. It's hidden, you don't say it, but in the world of economics it's inefficient. You list all production on the production at the cost. Right? Okay. That's the setup. We'll do questions, I'll do tax, 1, 2 subsidies, 1 plus 4. That should be good enough. The final is when? December 10. December 10, right? Less than a month. That is December 10. Right? Not exact, but around probably 70% is second half. 30% is probably first half. Say, right? Say. That 70% 20%, you can think about it, has two parts, supply, market. The market is lecture 9, 10, 11. The supply is 6, 7, 8. Alright? So if you want to sort of have more or less acceptable distribution, this should be like 35%, somewhere there. So a good chunk of the funnel is actually this lecture and the next two, which are the easiest one, right? It's basically MGEB02 stuff mathematically, right? If I were you, I would have studied every part of the last 3 lectures. That will give you 40% on the way to an average at least, right? Make sense? Because this, the mathematics you will see, the mathematics is basically addition, subtraction. You add, subtract, color a bit. That's it, right? No derivative there at all, right? No, nothing really complex. Alright? Lots of concept though. So if I were you, I would done those 3 ups and downs, done the supply theory, check my midterm, learn that as well. That would be good enough problem. You don't have time to do the whole thing, right? But if you want to basically efficiently study, that's probably the way to do it. Anyway, okay, question 1. That is a tax. This is the demand. Just a note, sometimes the question doesn't tell you graph it. Say this question did not say graph it, but you should graph it. If you don't graph it and you get it wrong, who knows what you're doing? You're just working with numbers and you can't work with numbers, right? So you're not going to get partial points much. If you graph it, the graph talks. The graph is right and everything is there. It's just a calculation error, right? So make sure you graph even if the question doesn't ask. Because otherwise, if you get it wrong, you don't get much, right? If you graph it, you get mark for the graph, right? Anyway, if I were you, I would graph this. I identify every point on it, I would have gone from there. That is the supply. That's the supply. We need the compatible equilibrium before we start. What's the equilibrium price? That looks like 40. Is it? On 410, 40, right? 40. Alright? 410. That's the price. So, if that's the case, then that would be 220. That's a compatible equilibrium. Alright? Alright? Okay? Okay. When there is tax, consumer pay what producer gets plus the tax. And you have a no equilibrium there where the supply and demand are equal. So to apply the tax and fund post-tax equilibrium, you need the inverse. Let's get the inverse. That's the inverse demand. That is the inverse supply. So now I'm going to apply those two equations to get the post-tax equilibrium. That is PD. This is PD equal to PS this is PS plus the tax. That's equation number 1 applied. Recall we did this in lecture number 1. Then I have to lift the subscript to get the non-equilibrium. That's equation number 2 applied. So get quantity which will be to the left of this month. That is what you're funding. That's the price consumer pay. That's the price producer gets. We'll see what we get there. I'm rearranging them. So I rearrange them, solve for Q them. What do you get? What's the equilibrium cost X? You will be lower than 220. I know, well, you can see it on the graph, it's lower than 220. What do you get? Must be lower than 220, higher than 100. That's what the graph says. How much do you get? 100? 99?
Yeah, 199.
199. That is 199, do I remember it? So put 199 here, find the price consumer pay. How much that would be? That would be 301 divided by 7, which is 43. And the producer get $10 less, so that would be 33. Make sense? That should be A, that's B, that's C, that's D. We have all the numbers to calculate them now. What's the change in the consumer surplus? Consumer loses A, loses C. A is 3 multiplied by 199. They lose C. C is 3 multiplied by 21 divided by 2. Say that. Alright? Producer loses B and D. B is 7 multiplied by 199. D is 7 multiplied by 21 divided by 2. Right? Make sense? Now there's a government there. The government gains A and B, which is 10 multiplied by 199. So the DW is, this is a trade-off. It's a trade-off. The loss is 10 multiplied by 21 divided by 2, which is 105 bucks, which is basically this area. That's the development. Right? Now, the way the question was, it asked you to calculate all those components. You can't go there and say, well, let's just calculate C and D directly. That was fine the way the question is stated, but on the final, the question says, find the change in the consumer surplus, find the change in producer surplus, find the change in the government surplus, and verify the welfare effect. So we have to go through all this. You cannot just say, well, on the graph you can see it there, right? Then just calculate C and D directly. Right? Okay. How many points do you think this had? 6 points? Depending on the year, it was 7, sometimes 8, sometimes 6, but depending on the year. It was somewhere between those. If you basically have done it several times, it's not going to take long. It takes less than 5 minutes, right? Make sense? I marked the final, good chunk of finals. So this question does not average very high. Don't assume like 89% answer. It's around 50%. Get it right. The other 50% they either have the numbers wrong, calculation error, or the whole thing is wrong. Right? So don't assume, well, this question done by everyone, not true at all, right? You don't practice, you can't do it, right? You go there, try to figure it out, you just no time, right? Make sense? Okay. But you can see, you will see something different from this lecture on the final, and you can see what are represented here. Tax, subsidy I think is better. I like subsidy better. And price floor. There are 3 cases only. Alright? Tax, subsidy, price floor. Price ceiling, we rarely do it. It's the easiest one. We don't do it. Anyway, subsidy. Subsidy. That is the equilibrium. We need comparative equilibrium before we do anything. So what's the comparative equilibrium here? If you put these two equal, what's the price? That should be 40 divided by, I guess that's 0.5. 40 divided by 80, right? Alright? That sounds like 40, 80. What's the quantity? 40, that's 64, am I right? 64. 80 minus half of 32, that's 64. So now we have a subsidy. In the subsidy, the consumer pays what producer gets minus the subsidy. And as always, demand and supply should be equal. So that will give us equilibrium to the right, not to the left. That is what the producer gets. That's what the consumer pays. This is subsidy. In this case, 25 cents, 30 cents. So to apply the subsidy, we need the inverse. Let's get the inverse. That's the inverse demand. That's the inverse supply. Now I can apply these two equations. AD 32 minus Q32 equal to Q48 minus 4048 minus SPD, SPS, that is subsidy. Okay. So now let's rearrange it. And solve it. So what would be the equilibrium? It would be higher than 64, you can see it there. What's the post-subsidy equilibrium? You can see on the graph, that would be higher than 64. What do you get? 69? 69 point? 23? 76. That's rounded. 69.8. 69.8. Okay, so what would be the change in the consumer surplus? Okay, the consumer surplus was this before. That's before. before. Now it becomes this. Right? So consumer gains this area. Consumer gains this area. I split that area in two already. You can see 1, 2. Although you can solve it at once, but I split in two. And that would be how much? I need the price. So let's get the price. Get 69.8. There, what do we get? The price consumer pay should be 10.2 divided by 32. How much is that? That's the equilibrium price. This is this one. I want that one before I solve the rest. What's the price the consumer pays? Put 69.8 there. That will be 80 minus that, which is 10.2 divided by 32. How much do you get? What is 10.8 divided by 10.2 divided by 32? 133? 32. So producer get 30 cents more, 62. So now I have all the numbers. One is 18 cents multiplied by 64. That's 1. Plus 2 is 18 cents multiplied by 5.8 divided by 2. That's 2. Right? Make sense? That's 1, 2. Okay. That's the consumer. Producer surplus was this before. Now it becomes this. So producer gains the upper area, which is this one. Again, we split it in two. Let's call this 3. Let's call this 4. That would be easier to solve. So producer surplus will change by 3. What is 3? 12 cents multiplied by 64. That's 3. 4. That is 12 cents multiplied by 5.8 divided by 2. Make sense? Right? I'm pretty sure there's a formula to get the whole thing at once. But if you split it into, that's nicer. It's easier to do, right? Okay. Now what about the government? The government pays 30 cents on 69.8 units. So the government surplus is, what color should I use? This one. That's the government surplus. That's what the government loses. And the sum, that is deadweight loss, which is welfare loss. Right? What do you get? Take these 3 and add them up. What do you get? I will tell you what should you get. You should get this area. You can see you should get this area, which is 30 cents. You should get 30 cents multiplied by 5.8 divided by 2. See if you get it. If you don't, then we have an issue. You should get that area that I graphed up there, which should be 30 cents. Too small. Come on. Should be 30 cents. Divided by 2. This is DW. Verify it. What would be this number anyway? So the way I did it, I calculated that shaded area, but here we're doing it incrementally. What would be 0.3 multiplied by 5.8 divided by 2? How much is this one?
0.87.
Do you get the same thing up there? You get the same thing there, right? This is the same thing. Again, you can calculate the weight loss directly, but the question specifically asks you to calculate the change in this, the change in that, the change in that, verify. Alright? Make sense? Okay. I'll do one more subsidy and then change it to floor. Let's take a break though. Let's take a short break.